I talk on the Cherokee and the Creek War. A lot of people might not know me. I'm Susan Abram. I work over at Western Carolina University and also teach over at Southwestern Community College here in, just a few miles away. And a lot of people have wondered, well, what does the Creek War have to do with the National Trail of Tears? Well, if you've listened to Tom Bell or read some of Tom's previous work, you will notice that when he talks about it, it's not like, well, this is a war and then it's over, and this was an event and then it's over, and this is the Trail of Tears and then it's over. No, it's everything is present. So there is no real past because the past shapes the present, and so we are still living with all of this history together. And so today what I want to do is kind of look at how the Creek War is directly connected with the Trail of Tears and the people that fought in the Creek War. So let's start with a map of the Creek War. Obviously, this is part of the larger part of the War of 1812, which took part from 1812 to the early part of 1815. And while everyone was fighting against the British and their northern Indian allies here in the South, Andrew Jackson and people also from the states of Georgia and then the Mississippi Territory and their Indian allies are fighting against some of the Creek Indians who have joined with Tecumseh and some of the British efforts in the north. What we see, and we're going to concentrate on today, is just the northern edge of this map here, all the way down to where it says Horseshoe Bend, right there in the center. And as we go on, you'll get to learn a little bit about this war. I have to stop and give a little background about this before we go on. And I know most of you probably know the Cherokees fought in the Creek War, that Andrew Jackson even gave some of the claim to the victory to the Cherokees. And he did, but then it just kind of falls by the wayside. So we're going to look at that today too. The Creek War was over in a matter of just a few months. And the Creek War was actually a civil war. It was fought between those who might be termed the National Creeks, who promoted the civilization policy of the United States, who were friends with the American agent, who embraced farming and were even developing plantation systems, versus another group that was against this type of assimilation, and these would become known as the Red Stick Creeks because they would carry a red war club, and red was the color of war, represented blood. And so when they have a separation of ways here, and some of them want to support the United States and others want to support the British and their Indian allies in the north, Andrew Jackson pretty much takes offense at this because some of the depredations have been committed on Tennessee land, and he uses this as an excuse to invade Creek country. The National Creeks are actually asking for United States help to put down this rebellion, and they go to the Cherokees, the Chickasaws, and the Choctaws to ask for their assistance as well, and they do decide to help the United States. The Cherokees, of course, are the Creek's northern neighbors and Tennessee's kind of southern neighbors, and then they live in North Georgia and western North Carolina and parts of what will become northeastern Alabama. And so they have seen firsthand some of the problems caused by the Creek Civil War. Some of the refugees from the war are actually coming up and seeking protection within some of those lower Cherokee towns, such as Turkeytown, where Principal Chief Pathkiller is living. And so they, of course, are worried that a lot of this war is going to invade their own boundaries, and they decide to help the United States. There's 2 campaigns, each about 3 months in the fall of 1813 and 3 months at the beginning of 1814, with the big battle taking place March 27th, 1814, the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, which is probably, if you've ever heard about the Creek War, that's the one and only thing that's been brought up. And this is where the Cherokees really helped Jackson defeat and kind of break the back of most of the resistance in Alabama of the Red Sticks. The few that remain go down into the Florida area and join with the Seminoles to continue their resistance. But we see that you have Tallahatchie, Talladega, Onotochoco, Muckfall Creek, and then Horseshoe Bend. In addition, there's another massacre that takes place that the Cherokees are involved with, and that is at Hillaby, because the Hillaby Creeks had already surrendered to Jackson, but somehow the word just did not get back to the general that was sent against them, and they come in and destroy that town pretty much completely. Didn't leave any warriors, and there was about 250 women and children that they took captive that day. But from that point forward, it did make the Creek not want to surrender at all, because they didn't believe that if they surrendered or raised a white flag that any mercy would be shown them. Though we also see here Fort Armstrong by Fort Deposit. It's right at the edge of the Alabama-Georgia line at the top of the Coosa River here. Fort Armstrong becomes a really important thing for the Cherokees, because they're the ones that man it. After Andrew Jackson's troops desert him, they up and desert him between the fall and the spring campaign, and he has to start recruiting an army from scratch, just about. Only his veteran officers remained with him. And if it hadn't been for the Cherokees serving at Armstrong and kind of patrolling the borders, acting as spies, guarding the provisions, it's no telling what would have happened. But they do stay, and they stay throughout the entire campaign. Many of them don't even take a break to go home. So go ahead and change that, Deidre. Here is a map of the Horseshoe Bend, because we're going to talk about this. This is what most people hear about. This is a bend in the Totalpika River, and as you see, it's horseshoe-shaped here. And these represent the houses from this refugee village. This represents the high ground, a real incline. And then you have a log barricade that is very, very formidable. This is about 5 to 8 feet tall. It has portholes that if you lay down, you can shoot out of it. If you kneel, you can shoot out of it. Or if you stand, you can shoot out this. And it's kind of crisscross, so that anyone making a frontal assault is just going to be mowed down. I mean, it's very, very suicidal to even come near this. So what Jackson does is Jackson gets there on the morning of March 27th, and he goes and sets up, go ahead and change that again. He goes ahead and sets up here, and you can see where the Army is. This is the militia and the U.S. 39. And right on this hill here, he sets up 2 cannons, and he commences to try to blow that log barricade into oblivion. And all he does is basically make a few toothpicks, a few splinters, because it just withstands everything. And so for 2 hours he's doing this. He keeps beating it and beating it and beating it, and nothing happens. So here's another map of that. And what you see up there where the arrow is the Cherokee. The Cherokees, along with John Coffey's cavalry and along with some of the National Creeks, have been ordered to surround the peninsula to make sure that none of the Red Sticks escape, cross the Totalpika River and go down it or whatever. So they're there to be sharpshooters. The Cherokee hear this going on for 2 hours, and they say, you know, we didn't come just to sit here. And so on their own, with no orders from Jackson, 3 of those men decide to swim the Totalpika River. And they do so, and one is shot. He's injured by one of the sentries that's watching on the other side. His friends put him into one of the canoes that's moored there, and they swim back across this swollen river because the spring rains had made this river just really torrential. And once they get back, then they start ferrying other Cherokee warriors back and forth, getting more canoes and ferrying more and more soldiers across to the other side. So before long, you have a huge contingency of Cherokee warriors right at the village of Totalpika. And so while they're fighting their way through the village and up that high ground, taking lots and lots of casualties, Jackson finally gets the word of what's going on, because he sees a few of the front line creek protectors leaving and rushing to the rear. And so this is when he takes it as his opportunity to make that frontal assault. And of course, it's bloody, it's gory, it's horrible, and lots of lives are lost taking the log barricade, but they do breach it. And so you have this front and back squeeze against the Red Sticks, and by that night there was about 900 dead warriors on that peninsula, and about 250 women and children that had been taken captive. Some women were killed also. Some children were actually killed during this time. They said that it was so bloody that the river ran red that day. And, you know, there were just a few holdouts that they cleaned up the next day. And of course, nobody surrendered. Even if they were given the chance, no one would surrender because of what happened at Hillaby. So the war's over. Basically, the Creek War is over. The resistance is broken. People are mustering out and going home, and this includes some of the Cherokees. There's a picture of Horseshoe Bend National Military Park, a picture of the Totalpika where the Cherokees crossed. Here's a picture looking towards where the village would have been, and then up on the little hillock where the artillery was placed, and Jackson stood back there almost the entire battle. And if you ever get a chance and you have not seen this military park, it's well interpreted, and I highly recommend it. And there is the National Park Service map of their interpretation, and you can see the big arrow there, the big reddish-orange arrow, that's where the Cherokee crossed, and versus the little firepower of Andrew Jackson's cannon on the other side of the log barricade. Okay. So we have people mustering out in April of 1814 and headed home, including Captain Shoeboots. And they're all excited, and they're very, proud of the part that they took and the victory they received. And Shoeboots is saying, I really want to go back to war. I have this great desire to. The mouse is shot kind of in the grazed in the left chest, and he's opening his shirt to show the bullet wound and also the hole that went through his jacket as like a badge of honor. And you hear about these stories even in through 1849, when Charles Lanham comes through this area of the country, and he is still hearing stories about some of the valor, the honor of these Cherokee warriors. So it's not like even as late as that those veterans who served in the Creek War had forgotten anything about it. So this was even after removal. They were still referring back to their service in the Creek War. Now, we also see at this point in time, by 1823, lots of Cherokee land cessions to the U.S. government. some important ones in 1817 and 1819, and if you listen to Russell Townsend's talk and Tyler Howe, they talked about how, you know, that became the nucleus of for the Eastern Band of Cherokee. But it wasn't the only cession. There are other allies of the Cherokee government during this time. The Chickasaws and the Choctaw were expected to give up acreage. So it wasn't just the Creeks who lost 20 million acres at the end of the Creek War. Just a few years later, everyone was required to kind of give away some of their land, and negotiations took place. So we have 1823, President James Monroe is up at the White House, and Pathkiller and the Cherokee National Council are kind of beseeching him. They're insisting, this is it, we're not giving away anymore. And they refer back to the war in doing so. And they say the cooperation of the red man and the white man in subduing the common enemy during the late war, and the blood which has been lost on that occasion at Tallushatchee, Talladega, Notochopco, Hillaby, Amukfa, Totalpika, we conceive to be no more than what has been expected from our hands as children and true friends to our father the president. Those acts we've performed are proof of the sincerity of our affections and fidelity, and show the firm hold by which the hand of our father is grasped more forcibly than volumes of promises. So they're still reminding them of that blooded relationship that put them together, and they consider this, and you'll see in the literature, they're writing constantly about our part in the late war, about this band of brothers, the Americans and the Cherokee together. So they haven't forgotten their part in this. But the tensions just continue to get worse. There's some of the land cessions, not only of the Cherokee, but some of the other tribes in the 1820s. And you can just see it being whittled away over and over. So then we get 20 years after the war. We come up to 1834. And they have sent a delegation to Washington, D.C. This includes John Ross and Richard Taylor, Daniel McCoy, Harry Conrad, and John Timpson. All of these men had fought in the Creek War. They were veterans. And they plead and say 20 years have now elapsed. Of course, this is to Jackson. He's in there now. 20 years have now elapsed since we participated with you in the toils and dangers of war and obtained a victory over the fortunate and deluded red foe at Totalpika on the memorable 27th of March, 1814. That portentous day was shrouded by a cloud of darkness, be sprinkled with awful streaks of blood and death, and it is in the hour of such times alone that the heart of man can be truly tested and correctly judged. We were then your friends, and the conduct of a man is an index to his disposition. Now, in these days of profound peace, why should the gallant soldiers who in time of war walked hand in hand through the blood and the carnage be not still friends? We answer that we are yet your friends, and we love our people, our country, and the homes of the childhood of our departed sires. And you've heard this kind of language throughout this conference about how they are tied to the land because this is the land of their fathers. And what they are doing here is trying to, again, use that rhetoric of brotherhood and blood in order to say, come to your senses. You know, what are you doing? We are your friends. And so then just a short 2 years later, of course this is a year after the Treaty of New Echota, we still get that the Cherokees believe there is some kind of sense of brotherhood because they have served as a band of brothers, and they even use that term, band of brothers. And so Ross and 19 others go up to the U.S. Senate to memorialize them, to negate the Treaty of New Echota, which was fraudulently signed. And they say, with the people of the United States and their difficulties, we have made a common cause, again referring back to the war. We've stood side by side with the present magistrate, meaning Jackson, in the battlefield, and freely our people have shed their blood for the interest, honor, and glory of the American people. And so, of course, we all know what happens. This falls on deaf ears. And though they say, we know you possess the power, but by the tie that unites us yonder, we implore you to forbear. We know that the Trail of Tears did occur, and the forced removal took place in 1838 and 1839. So, needless to say, if you look at the Cherokees writing and trying to beseech the United States to come to its senses, they're constantly referring to our part in the late war and the blood that we shed on that occasion, and again, as Band of Brothers. So they keep referring to this over and over and over. So the Creek War was very important, and it was one of the defenses of trying to say, this can't go on. And of course, we know that they even went to the U.S. Supreme Court and tried legal means. So it does go on. And so who are some of the people that are involved at this point in time? A lot of these are Cherokee veterans that take the yoke of leadership to fight removal, or who lead the new nation once it gets out to Indian Territory. You're all familiar with John Ross up here. At 23 years old, he served as the adjutant for the Cherokee Regiment, and then he becomes the chief who fights removal. Over here on the upper left is Major Ridge, who earned that title, that military title, during the Creek War, and he continues to be known instead of the Ridge as Major Ridge. He is the one that finally says, well, we might as well just sign and get what we can, and he's the one that leads the treaty party into signing the fraudulent Treaty of 1835. Sequoyah there in the middle, and Sequoyah was a private. He was a private in Captain John McLemore's company, and even though he was a little partially crippled, walked with a limp, he was very valued as a great marksman. He was a good hunter. So he served his time in the Creek War. George Lowry, here in the bottom right, he becomes later on assistant chief, and he is a real respected head man during this whole crisis. So we have these men who are now, instead of just being Cherokee veterans, they're Cherokee leaders, and they're respected. And the people that served under them or with them in the Creek War are saying, we need to help our veterans. We need to help those that were disabled because of the war. So when you see them fighting removal, when you see them fighting land cessions, they are also fighting to get some kind of pensions for their warriors that were disabled during this time. And the only time you really see it in writing for the first time is Article 14 of the 1835 New Echota Treaty. And within that treaty, there's a short blurb about, we will take care of the wounded warriors and they will receive pensions. Unfortunately, Congress may have had good intentions, but they don't appropriate the money until after the removal in 1842, several years after the removal. And so all this time, and we're talking many years since 1814, these people have struggled, and others within their families or their communities or their headmen or their officers have been taking care of them and their families. And it depends, of course, what they were wounded with. So let's see here. There were several that were actually exempt from removal. Here's a couple right here, Pigeon in the Water. He was also called Second Pigeon because if there was more than one man by a particular name that served in a company, he would be first, second, third, and so forth. So this was Second Pigeon in the Water. He was considered 3/4 disabled, and he had had a chest wound which just would not heal up. It continued to fester and open over the years. And 2 years before he died, which would have been 1838, his stepson did try to go to Washington, D.C. to get some pension funds, which still hadn't been appropriated. And so he died in September of 1840, well before there was any monetary compensation for him. Nichawee, a Valley Town warrior, was also left behind on the Trail of Tears. He was allowed to remain. He was crippled from receiving a gunshot at Horseshoe Bend that fractured his leg right above his knee. He served under Captain James Foster. And he was, they just didn't think that he could make the trip whatsoever, so he was allowed to remain. But in 1859, he has to hire a white attorney to kind of facilitate his pension. He has to do that because, let's see what it takes to get a pension. First of all, your name has to be on the official muster rolls. And there were a few people that never got on that roll. You have to have an officer, 2 officers actually, testify that you served and that you received a wound. Or if they are dead by this point in time, then you have to get 2 other people that the government considers reputable. If you're a widow applying on behalf of a deceased husband who is injured, you can't just do that yourself, because they don't look upon Cherokee women in the same regards that the Cherokee do, and so you have to get a male relative to do it for you. And then this is the kicker here. You have to have a military surgeon who attests to your injury and your severity of your disability. So if you went to a traditional medicine person instead of the U.S. Army surgeon, then you were out of luck. And so this is what happens to some of the people. But then why does Nichawee have to hire a white attorney? Because the officers and his friends that could attest to this, where are they? Hundreds of miles away in Indian Territory. So, he finally does get a little pension from this. But then due to the lack of evidence, we're not real sure. But I'm guessing that these disabled veterans, the ones that were forced to remove, died sooner than maybe they would have because of the harshness of the journey, the hardships, the complications. We know that the Beaver died before he ever got there. He died December 1st right on the trail. And he had had a claim for a half a disability. He had had a broken scapula or shoulder blade. And so he died before he got there. But then these other people here, you can see, and some of them we don't know their exact date of death, but we do know, like they say, well, they died within a year, or they died by this month or that date. So we might not have exact, but we do know that these disabled men died very shortly after coming through. And unlike the overtaker here, he had received a gunshot that took out and blew away most of his jaw. So he was forced on the Trail of Tears and died by that August. Young puppy carried a lead ball in his right thigh the entire way, walking on that the entire way. He died shortly after in October. And many of you probably know Going Snake, Crawling Snake. He actually led one of the immigration parties. He was considered 2/3 disabled because he had taken a gunshot to his back during Horseshoe Bend, and it had lodged near his spine, and it had to remain there. He never could get it removed, and so he died within the year there. But then we see that there are other people that have slipped through the cracks, but they're trying to reason, and they're trying to make their case using that rhetoric of blood that has become so important to the Cherokees in legitimizing their service to the U.S. And Colesawee here, he applies to the U.S. because he says, you know, I've fought for you, I've bled to assist you, and now I need your assistance in my old age. And he does have officers, very reputable officers, that say, yes, he was there, yes, he took a gunshot to the right side, and he is now entirely lame, entirely useless to his family as far as a breadwinner, but the U.S. denies his claim because they have no record of his injury. He did not see one of those Army surgeons. So therefore, the word of those officers is not good enough. And as a sideline, he is one of these in North Carolina that later signed his reserve for 640 acres in Macon County over to the state of North Carolina in 1829. So just to kind of finish up here, as the Cherokees considered their service within the Creek War and their friendship and their spilling of blood together as this relationship with the United States, you see on the other side, the U.S. has this rising tide of opposition for removal of all the eastern tribes, and you know, this of course includes the Cherokee, and this is like this tide just becomes a wall, very similar to that wall that Jackson couldn't get over. Now it's like, you know, here it is, it's unmovable, it's solid, and there's nothing we can do about it. So even though almost to the very end the Cherokees are trying to relate their service in the war to a reason why they should stay, and that they'd help to break that red stick power in the East, in the Southeast, you know, history now reveals that all that blood that they shed was in vain. Thank you. Are there any questions or comments? I had someone in the last session who said, "Oh, they're still doing that today. I haven't got my pension yet."
Exactly. Nothing has changed.
Do you have a question?
Well, more of a comment, I guess. You know, one thing about this that as I listened to, this has been a fantastic presentation to me for just the detail and the level of it. I'll use a lot of it.
Thank you.
This whole idea of creating, well, I'm thinking about blood, you know, and what that has meant culturally in the whole of Cherokee society, you know, in terms of power and that's playing in there somehow as well. But what has really struck me about this battle, and as you say, for going on for 30 years afterwards, is that there is still this sense among the Cherokees of the continuing obligation, you know, trying to create an obligation that again goes back to blood law and the whole sort of philosophy and worldview that underlies that.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's very cultural and deep
obligation
and significant.
The continuing call to the United States to be honorable, to honor its debts, to honor its obligation, and how much of that is rooted in the Cherokees' own sense of that, and just, I don't know, if there's just never an understanding that the United States is not going to behave that way, or an understanding that they're not going to behave that way, but nevertheless still.
And it was almost incomprehensible to this culture,
Exactly.
because, you know, they just, well, nobody would do that.
Nobody
you
would
know.
do that.
But they did, so, that's a good point, very good point. Yes?
Full disclosure before I say what I'm about to say, that I am the executive director for Major Ridge Home in Rome. I would just like to put a little different thought on, you said, Major Ridge, who came to believe, let's get what we can for it and go west. He gave a really impassioned speech to the Tribal Council in 1836, in which he said, and he was against removal, but he came to believe that the land would do them no good if they all died trying to keep it. And that was the crux of his 1836 speech, to the tribal council that he grew up on these lands, that the lands came to them from the Creator, the white men got theirs from the British, that he had hunted the lands, he had fought for the lands, but he believed that his children and his grandchildren would not exist and would have nothing if the whole nation died. So his belief was that to preserve the nation, to give up the land.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, you can't fault him with if you really study Major Ridge, he was a man of honor, and he was a warrior that had served in many capacities throughout, and he was a protector of the people. And so, I mean, maybe he didn't agree with the majority of the Cherokees who were fighting against removal. You know, and there was lots of friction. We all know what happened later once he gets out there, and the rest of the Cherokee arrived too. But the whole point of it is that most of the Cherokees believed somehow that the honor of the U.S. would step it up, and that people would allow them to remain if they were just stubborn enough, I think, because this was their home. And again, they have that connection that is there, and it's just like, well, why do we even have to explain this? It's so obvious. And it does have the idea of the rhetoric of your ancestors and the rhetoric of blood. Yes?
One of the paradoxes of the whole thing, what did Jackson do with the leader of the Red Sticks?
Which leader? Because there wasn't just
There
one.
was the one of the half-breed, mixed blood.
Are you talking about Weatherford?
Yeah, I think.
Well, he wasn't at Horseshoe Bend. He was not at Horseshoe Bend. He later on comes into Jackson's camp and surrenders because he says there's none of us left to fight. And Jackson lets him go. Manawa was at, or Manawa, I've heard both pronunciations, but he was at Horseshoe Bend, and he does escape, and he goes on and to become still a leading headman, and he continues even after peacetime. But he is one of the very few, I mean a handful, that survives that day at Horseshoe Bend. Yes?
Is there anything in Jackson's papers that sheds any light on why he would turn his back on men in arms that served honorably with him?
Jackson is full of paradoxes and contradictions, in not just dealing with Native Americans, but ideas about states' rights and all of this. Jackson felt himself speaking for the majority of people. And the bottom line is the Native Americans were in the way of white American expansion. I mean, he goes on and takes some of the early cessions, and he puts cotton plantations down on the Tennessee River in some of those cessions, as well as John Coffey does. Even though they fought in the war just a couple of years before that together with the Cherokees. He kind of tries to say, well, I'm being good to these people, and I'm protecting them from the bad influences and all this. And I will have to give credit where credit is due. Jackson did argue that the Cherokee warriors received the same money for their pay, for their rank status, that American soldiers did. So, a U.S. private or a Cherokee private, they both got $8 a month. And so if you were on half disability, you would receive $4 a month. And so there's not any good reason for that. I know what he says, but my bottom line is the man just really, that was not his priority. And he was not trying to be benevolent to the Cherokee or other Native Americans by putting them out west beyond the reach of these corrupted white men. Other people say, well, look, he adopted a little Creek boy that was left an orphan at one of those battles. But you never see that little boy becoming absolutely part and equal in that family. Yes, he learned him a trade. Yes, he said take care of him. But if you read the letters and you kind of get the feel for it, it was more like Lincoln became like a pet for the family. or somebody that they would take care of. And maybe that was to kind of ease his own guilt about killing the mother. I don't really know, but there's all kinds of paradoxes and contradictions when it comes to Andrew Jackson. Yes?
Charles Hicks was at Horseshoe Bend. Does your research shed any light on his service?
He was at Horseshoe Bend, but he was at Fort Armstrong. He had a whole month where Captain Hicks led a particular group or company of men to do the guarding at Fort Armstrong. Of course, think about this. Armstrong is not very far away from Turkey Town, where Path Killer is, and they were taking in a lot of the Creek refugees, and they felt that the town could be attacked at any time. So those people stayed vigilant. Even when there weren't American soldiers out there, the Cherokee were very vigilant to some kind of red stick incursion within their own time. But Charles Hicks was very much involved in that period. Anybody else?
You know, in the early 1830s, there's a lot of war going on in the whole United States. So you take there was the Alamo going on in the 30s.
Oh, yeah, and then Southerners had their eye on that for expansion of cotton and slavery into that area way back when. So, you know, it's like they get Alabama fever first because they want the creeks removed. After the creeks are removed, they start working on the other tribes. And then, you know, what's next? Texas. Absolutely. Anyone else? Well, you've been a really good audience, and I thank you for the opportunity.